Hi everyone. Today I am here with you guys for a writing specific video. I've talked in the last couple of videos quite a bit about philosophy and about politics specifically, so we're going to step away from that just for a little bit and talk about writing and philosophy, but mainly as it relates to writing. Nothing political here today, guys. So this may still ruffle a few feathers, and with videos like this, I think it's important to put the disclaimer out there that I am not attacking anyone in particular here. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad about themselves, and I am not saying here that lest anybody who's watching this is in my authors and writers circles. This is a general overview of the topic. It is not aimed at any particular person. Any observations that I make in the video here are from overall experience that I have had with writers throughout the years, some of them that I'm still in contact with, some of them not. I'm not going to name any names or anything in here. We're focusing purely on the mindset and philosophical aspect of writing in this video. So, with that out of the way, today's topic is the topic of inspirational writing. So you'll see on the title slide that we have here, we've got inspirational or intentional. That is the name of the video lecture for today. And underneath it, you'll see that the little subtitle says, "Why Inspirational Writing is a Disaster Waiting to Happen." So maybe you can see already why this might ruffle some feathers. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's start out with describing how I'm defining what an inspirational writer is, because I don't want to leave anybody confused about exactly what we're talking about here. So an inspirational writer is not someone who is writing inspirational fiction. I mean, I suppose you could call that an inspirational writer, but in this case, that is not what we're talking about. We are talking about people who are writing based on inspiration. Usually these writers are writing with a lack of clear direction, at least when they first start out. Their ideas are generated totally from the subconscious. We'll get to what that means in a bit. Usually with these writers, you're also going to see a lack of themes, or if they have a theme, a lack of good integration between theme and plot. So, what are some key phrases that indicate that you or someone that you're talking with might be an inspirational writer? So here are some of the ones that I have heard the most often from writers that I have worked with that I know are inspirational writers. First one on the list is usually, when you ask them where they come up with their ideas, the response is, "It just came to me." Or for Christian writers, usually the version is, "God inspired me." It's a very, the muse gave me the idea kind of way of thinking. Another one that I'll commonly hear from people is, "I don't know how I came up with it. I just kind of did." You will also a lot of times hear these writers saying things like, "I can't think of anything to write about," or "I'm just not inspired right now, so I guess I won't write." I also hear them asking a lot of times, "What do you guys want me to write?" Usually this is with inspirational writers who have a bit more of a fan group, or people who regularly interact with them during the writing process. So you'll get these writers putting out polls, opinion polls, asking fans what they want to see next for the next book. So they tend to invite other people to tell them what they should write about based off of what people want. But again, that's not usually something you'll see with ones who have not established some sort of an audience. Because, a beginning writer is probably not going to be asking this. They don't have anyone to ask. Especially if they're in a situation that a lot of writers are in where their, main audience is family, and their family could care less what they write, so they'll get no meaningful answer, and they know it, so they're not going to ask it. Moving on from that, though, you might also hear an inspirational writer say, "Well, I'm just not feeling it today." A big one that I hear from inspirational writers is, "I don't need an outline. I'll hear this from even established writers. They say, I just write as it comes to me. I don't need an outline. I don't outline anything. Another thing that goes along with this is that a lot of times I will also hear them say, I don't outline because if I outline it, then I no longer have any interest in writing it. We're going to talk about that issue separately when we discuss beginning writers who tend to usually fall into this inspirational writer category. But it's they're kind of their own separate category because it's more of an instinctual thing and a lack of knowledge usually, rather than they just are this way. And then the final thing that I've heard a lot from people who are inspirational writers is, nothing I'm writing lately feels right, so maybe I'm just a bad writer. This is also sometimes accompanied for those who do self-publish or have, an indie publisher or even a traditional publisher. You'll hear them saying things like, I'm not selling any books. Maybe I just suck as a writer because nobody is buying it, nobody's reading it. What's the point? So I hear that one a lot too. Okay, so continuing in definitions, let's talk about what I mean when I say an intentional writer. So an intentional writer is somebody who writes with a clear purpose in mind. It is not a vague, I kind of know what I want to say. I know what I want to say and I know how I want to say it. An intentional writer is somebody who has a clear outline that is there to indicate their theme and also helps them to put out on paper in a clear way the points that are necessary to prove that theme or conclusion by the end. This goes for both fiction and nonfiction intentional writers, although the precise way that they go about the outline might look a little different depending on what they're writing. The third thing is that they view writing as a skill just like any other, not as some mystical ability that only presents when the muse speaks. So you're not going to hear this kind of a writer saying, well, God just inspired me, or the idea just struck me out of the blue like lightning. You're not going to hear them saying that because they look at writing as a skill. Now, if you ask them about where the idea came from, for Christian writers, you may still hear an intentional writer telling you that the idea came to them, that God inspired the idea. But there's a big difference here between the intentional writer and the inspirational writer in how they go about telling you that. With an inspirational writer, the only thing you're going to get is that God inspired it. That's the end of the story for them. God gave me the idea. When you talk to an intentional Christian writer, they're not going to tell you that. You're more likely to hear them say something along the lines of, well, I was reading such and such today, and I happened to think of this Bible verse that went along with it, and I feel like God was kind of, nudging me in this direction. But they're going to follow it up with, and this is the reason why I wanted to write it. So, yes, you can still find an intentional writer who believes that God in some way influenced their theme or their idea, but not that God, zapped them with the idea out of the blue. Not that it's not subconscious, it's conscious. They know where their idea came from, and if you asked them, they could directly trace the so-called inspiration for the idea to where it came from, because they put some actual thought into it. It's not just their subconscious mind generating the idea and they have no idea where it came from. So your intentional writer is going to not see writing as some sort of mystical ability that just sort of happens. They see it as a skill like any other, and that means that you have to, work at it, that some people are going to be better than others naturally, but that the more work you put into it, the better you're going to be. Some example phrases that indicate that you or someone that you're talking to are an intentional writer. And guys, keep in mind here that these are just general examples. The phrasing can come in a lot of different ways, but it's the idea behind what they're saying that is the indication here. But anyway, first up on the list, this plot doesn't seem to be achieving my end goal, so how do I fix it? You are not going to hear that from an inspirational writer. They're not going to be asking how do they fix their plot, because they probably haven't even realized yet that the plot isn't achieving the end goal, and because they don't usually have themes, they probably haven't realized that they may not even have an end goal. The second thing that you will hear a lot of times from intentional writers is, I'm struggling to write today, but I'm making myself stick to my schedule. You'll usually hear this when they're not necessarily when they've hit a block or a stopping point for some reason, but because they're just like, their feeling side of it, they're not feeling like doing it. They're just not in the mood. You're going to hear intentional writers tell you, I just have to make myself push through that and write anyway. Another one on the list is, I hit writer's block, so I'm busy trying to figure out why I don't like the scene I'm working on. So usually with intentional writers, they recognize that if they're stuck, there's usually a reason. There can be a lot of different reasons, but this kind of moves into the next one, which is, I'm stuck, so I'm trying to work out why. My family hears some variation of this from me all the time. I get stuck on some point that I'm working on because I know what I consciously intended to do, but my subconscious mind is not finding a way to make it work when I actually sit down to put it on paper. So there's some sort of a conflict between the two, and I may or may not know what it is, so I'm sitting there trying to figure out why it's a problem and how to fix the problem. These last three are kind of more related to the mindset or the way that intentional writers kind of look at the world in general and how it relates to their work. But the next one on our list is, I happen to notice, XYZ, whatever that is, today, and I thought, hey, that would be the perfect example of my theme in my new novel, so let me include it. Another one is, I was reading this yesterday and I loved this part of the book because the author did XYZ. They're going to intentionally identify the things that they did or did not like about a book, and these kinds of writers are going to be able to tell you exactly why they didn't like it or why they did. Another one, I learned, fill in the blank with whatever it is they learned. I learned this today, and I just realized that's exactly what I needed to fill in a hole in my novel. So, an example of this one, guys, from my own personal experience, some of you may know that I was in accounting before I started my master's in composition and English. I really hate accounting. It is not my thing. Good at it or not, it just is not for me. But at one point when I was sitting in tax class, the instructor, I don't even remember exactly what he was talking about now. I think he was talking about something relating to the monetary systems in tax structures, and talking about the different tax structures that you can have. And he would probably have not thought I was a very good student if he had known this was what I was doing. But when he said that and he was talking through those concepts, it dawned on me that I was completely missing the monetary system for the world that I was writing in. And so I spent the entire rest of the class period figuring out how their monetary and tax structures worked. So that's an example of this last one where this sort of writer learns something and they're going to make connections with what they learned to other things, and they're thinking about how the world around them can inform their subconscious and their writing process. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, hopefully, first of all, if you noticed, there's a pretty big difference in the types of phrases that each one says. And this stems from their viewpoint on writing as a whole, right? Okay. So, you might notice that in the inspirational writer's case, you're getting a lot of vague ideas and phrases here. Things like, it just came to me, or God inspired me. I don't know where it came from. It just kind of did. It struck me one day. I'm not feeling like it. It's very feelings based. There's not much that's actually concrete or specific about anything with the inspirational writer. You really would have to work in order to get any sort of actual reasoning out of them for what they're doing, mainly because they usually don't know why they did whatever they did. They could not explain to you why they chose to keep a particular scene versus remove it without first sitting down and thinking about it for quite a while, because they didn't think about it when they first put it down on paper. They just did whatever came to mind, because that's how writing by inspiration works. The other thing that you might notice about the behaviors of the two in the phrases that we went over is that you have the inspirational writer, when things get tough, they give up. Or if they have a little bit more experience or they really enjoy the process of writing, normally you'll have them setting it aside in the hopes that their subconscious mind will kind of work on the problem in the background and figure it out for them. That's in stark contrast to what an intentional writer does, because the intentional writer is going to be asking why. That is one of their favorite questions to ask, is why. Why keep this? Why would I remove this? Why this theme? Why did it get written that way? Why am I writing it this way? Why isn't it working? Why does it work? Okay, there are a million other versions of why and related why questions that they may be asking, but you get the point. The intentional writer is constantly looking for those connections and asking why. The second thing that you might have also noticed is the difference between the inspirational writers and the intentional writers is a difference of collaboration versus introspection. Now, let me clarify what I mean there, because I am not saying here that the intentional writer never gets input, or that they never talk to anyone else, or that they just write as if they are on an island with no human contact. That is not what I'm saying, okay? So please do not take that message away from this, because that's not the case at all. What I'm saying here is that the intentional writer does not go to other people during the ideas phase, usually. They may at times brainstorm to come up with ways to approach a problem, but they're not likely to be found going to their fan group and saying, what do you guys want me to write? Because the intentional writer knows what theme they want to focus on, what interests them, and why they want to write it. So why would they ever go ask their fan group, what do you guys think I should write for my next book? They're not going to do that. You're going to see a lot more of that happening with the inspirational writers. And we'll kind of go over why that is when we talk about the problems with inspirational writing. But they are the writers that you're going to see most often going to their fan groups, their family, their friends, other, people that read their work and saying, what do you think I should write? With an intentional writer, you're going to get a lot more introspection. They're far, far more likely to be sitting there thinking about, what do I want to write? What interests me? Why does it interest me? How can I turn this into a story? What am I observing around me that I feel I have something important to say about that thing? Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it doesn't matter. What themes am I interested in actually telling a story about? So those are the kinds of things that an intentional writer is going to be thinking about that leads them down a very different path and away from the idea of collaborating with other people to come up with their story idea. The other difference is curiosity and intent. Now, notice that I put these two together. They are not exclusive here. So this is not something that's like one side does this and the other side does this. So with an intentional writer, you're usually going to see a combination of curiosity and intent. So intent is kind of bound up in the name, that they're intentional about the process. They are not looking for it to just strike them out of the blue what they should do. They're actually sitting down and consciously thinking about it and trying to figure out not only what they want to write, but how they want to approach it and the best way to approach it. They're also curious. Now, this is one where I wouldn't say that inspirational writers are never curious, but because they have this idea that they write when the inspiration strikes them, or they start working on a book when the inspiration for the idea strikes them, they're not really looking around the world for ideas. They're not looking at everything in their surroundings, observing it, and asking, how does this relate to my writing? How can I incorporate this? How can I understand what other people think and what other people believe, and then take that and work it into my fiction where it's relevant, or into my nonfiction if I'm writing about a specific philosophy or a specific mindset? They're not asking that. They're not curious like that. Now, it doesn't mean that they never want to learn new things. That's not what we're saying here. We're not saying that they never want to pick up a book about writing just to learn a new way of doing things. That's not what we're saying here. Both sides can do that. But you're not seeing a curiosity about the world in general. They're very linear thinkers unless you explain to them exactly how it relates to what they're doing, or they happen to get lucky and their subconscious mind grabs onto whatever they've just seen and makes the connection for them. They're not making those connections, and they're not curious about how it all connects. You're unlikely to see them sitting in a mall people watching and asking what that person's story is, or observing concrete facts and trying to figure out how that informs the way the person acts, or how, it informs life, and then trying to integrate that into their fiction. And that leads us into the last major difference that I've noticed between these two kinds of writers, and that is disintegration versus integration. So, with inspirational writers, usually, you see, especially with ones who are not very experienced, there is a massive disintegration in the way that the work is put together. They might start out with an idea that is good, but they have no idea how to execute it, and so the entire thing falls apart. Or they just get something that's mediocre. You do not usually find, unless they are, just extremely talented naturally, you usually will not find the inspirational sorts of writers writing particularly, dare I say, inspired work. They are not going to be the George Orwells or Ayn Rands of the literary world. They are, they may come up with something that's decent, but you're not going to see a solid integration of theme with the plot. So then with the intentional writers, you do see that, because they're the ones that are thinking about the theme to begin with. They're asking, what is this all about? What is the main idea that everything is going to revolve around? And then how do I connect everything that I write to that main idea for this novel or this essay or whatever it is? So they're integrating every element that they pick to include based off of the theme. So they're using that theme as the measuring stick or the guideline upon which they decide what goes and what stays. You're not going to see an inspirational writer doing that, because they don't have a theme. They don't know what the theme is until, if they're lucky, they've written something and it sort of just jumps out at them. And I'm not saying that there's no intentional writer that can have a theme happen that way, but generally speaking, it doesn't, unless it's kind of like a sub-theme. So, like, for example, you might have had a main theme, and then as you're reading through it, you're like, oh, well, I could see how a reader would also get this out of the story, because this is a kind of trend that happened to crop up. It wasn't their initial intent. They've accomplished their initial intent, but it happens to be there, and they couldn't really blame a reader if the reader looked at that and identified that as a theme. But it is not the main theme that the intentional writer was going for. So those are the major differences that you usually see between the two types. All right, so now let's talk about the harm of the mystical philosophy in writing. And I say mystical because it is very much a muse-style, mystical form of writing. We can call it inspirational today, but really it goes back to a very Plato-style way of thinking about the world, and a very mystical form of looking at everything. So the first issue that I usually notice cropping up, well, there are two main issues that I usually notice cropping up first, so they're at the top of the list. We'll start with the self-confidence issues. So for the majority of inspirational writers that I have worked with or known, they're constantly dealing with self-confidence issues because they don't see writing as a skill. They see it as something that is inspired. So they tie their identity as a writer to whether or not they have inspiration, because if you don't have inspiration, then how can you write? So if they're not inspired, then these writers are frequently going to feel down on themselves. And that's kind of where we get that first point that I had made about how they're going to say, nothing I'm writing lately feels right. So maybe I'm just a bad writer, or as I said, the variant of that for people who are published is that you'll hear them saying things like, I can't seem to make any sales, so my writing must just be bad. They jump automatically to their writing and them being the problem, rather than looking at the writing and going, okay, objectively speaking, if I'm not succeeding, then either one of two things is true. Either my writing is, in some way my writing is the problem, so let me make sure that first of all I deal with any personal issues that might be causing the problems, and then once that's out of the way, if I'm still stuck, let me figure out why. They don't have a problem-solving approach. It's not to say that they're never trying to solve a problem, but rather than jumping to how do I fix this problem and seeing the problem as divorced from their own self-esteem as a writer and their identity as a writer, they instead combine the idea of how well they're writing that day with how good of a writer they are. So if it's not working, I clearly must be a bad writer. And there's lots of variations of this, but typically it stems from that idea of seeing writing not as a skill, but as just an inspirational, mystical talent that you either have or don't. The second thing that I have noticed happen with some writers with this mindset is irrational self-confidence. This is kind of the flip side of the self-confidence issues, and this stems from the fact that the person is not objective about their own writing. Now, neither the people with the self-confidence issues nor the people with irrational self-confidence and arrogance about their writing are looking at their writing objectively. The difference is just that one of them is finding everything they can that is wrong with their work, and therefore extrapolating then from that they somehow are personally at fault or bad because their writing has problems. And oftentimes when you see that, they're not being objective because it's usually, generally, it's not as bad as they think it is. It can be fixed. It's not, excluding first drafts, if we're just looking at finished work after they've done all of the editing, the people who are nitpicking at all of the problems they can find, they're not being objective, and they're usually just looking for reasons why they should feel bad about the work. And it's usually not as bad as they think it is. When it comes to the irrational self-confidence side of the spectrum, on the other hand, these are the people that, once again, they're not looking at the work objectively. They're looking at it and thinking, I'm so great at this. Look at how well I write. I find that this happens more frequently than not with the authors who think that God inspired their writing and that they don't write anything that God didn't inspire. Or whatever, deity that you want to replace with. Typically, the people with the self-confidence issues are the ones who are unlikely to tell you that God inspired them to write what they did. They might say that God inspired their idea, but they are not going to say that God, inspired them to write specifically. The authors that I hear saying, God inspired me to write such and such, and God inspired me to do this and that, those are usually the writers where they are unbelievably unobjective about their own writing, and they just think it is the best thing in the world, so it could not possibly be their writing that is the problem, because they are an awesome writer. And anyone who doesn't recognize that, and anyone who points out all of the myriad problems with their work, is clearly just out to get them. So there's that side of the spectrum too, and obviously that's not conducive to you continuing to grow as a writer. So the people that have that problem, I find, are far less likely to grow than the people with the self-confidence issues because of this kind of writing. Because at least the people with the self-confidence issues are willing to take the critique and think about it. The third problem and the third harm that mystical forms of writing do to your work is a lack of structure in writing. This kind of stems from the idea that I write as the inspiration strikes me, so why on earth would I ever need to, be intentional and actually create an outline that explains how I'm going to prove my theme? So yeah, there's usually a lack of structure in the writing, and you'll find, maybe some scenes that don't really need to be there, scenes that don't really contribute anything, or sometimes, worse still, missing scenes. Things that, like, okay, it's not like there's a blank page in the middle of the novel that obviously shouldn't be there, but the reader gets the sense that something just is missing. There's not, the bridge between point A and point B is just not there. So you can get lack of structure both ways because of this. The next one on the list is lackluster writing. I observe this a lot because people with an inspirational style of writing, again, they're not really thinking it through. They're just writing it as it comes to them. And if they had a well-trained subconscious, then that might actually not be such a problem. I mean, eventually, down the road, some of these other problems would be an issue, but the lackluster writing might not. And this is where you do, admittedly, get some inspirational writers who do write very well, because, because of other aspects. They're reading a lot, or they generally tend to be an observant person, and they maybe make connections because of that at a subconscious level, and that comes out in their writing even though they didn't consciously think about it. So it is true that some people can get away with decent writing if they're writing inspirationally, but you are not going to see an inspirational writer getting Brandon Sanderson level writing with all of the detail included in that. Like, that's not going to happen. You're never going to see them attempt that because it wouldn't even occur to them. And if it did, they wouldn't know how to go about it, and it would fall apart. The next one on the list is a lack of growth. This usually happens for a couple of reasons. Again, it stems from an inspirational viewpoint of writing. But the first is because of lack of objectivity about their own writing. So that's like the next one on the list, but it kind of goes with the lack of growth. They're not able to be objective about their own writing because they're not going to sit there and think they don't have a theme to center it around. They don't have something to work off of to be objective. So it's just, do I feel like this should be here or not? There's no standard by which they are operating, and that lack of standard tends to lead to a lack of growth in the writing style itself because they're not identifying, objectively speaking, the points where they're weak. And they're also not identifying the points where they're strong, which then means that those with self-confidence issues never really are going to overcome that because they have nothing specific to point at to say, actually, I'm feeling really down on myself right now, but I can look at this piece of writing that I did and objectively say, here are the reasons why that's good. They're not going to be able to do that because they don't have the objectivity to do so. And then on the flip side of the spectrum, they're not going to grow if they're irrationally self-confident either, because then they're not identifying any of the problems. They're just looking at it and thinking everything's wonderful, and it's usually very, very far from being wonderful. The other reason that you usually see a lack of growth is because these sorts of individuals, again, are not looking for the connections. They're not asking why, and they are not reading materials with intent. They are not, other than writing guides, they're not reading anything to learn, usually. And by that, I mean they're not reading anything necessarily to learn how to be a better writer. They think that guidebooks are the only ways that you can really do that, because all the other ways require them to be very intentional about their approach, and that's not something that most of them have ever trained themselves to do. So unless they happen to get lucky, they're not going to learn that way. So unless somebody states the obvious for them, or somebody pulls the application out, they're not the kinds of people that you're going to find picking up a fiction book and saying, why did the author do that, and did it work? And what are the principles behind it that made it work? And how can I then keep those principles in mind for my own writing? You're not going to see that happening, but that is like one of the number one best ways that a writer grows, is by observing what was done well or poorly in other people's writing and why it is that way. So we've discussed lack of growth and objectivity kind of together there. The next one on the list then is lack of solid planning. This kind of goes back to their lack of structure, but essentially they have a vague idea of what they want to say. It's I kind of know where I'm going with this. Okay, but they really don't, because until you have put it into writing and solidly figured out where you're going, you don't know. If you're writing it when you get there and that's when you know what you want to say, chances are that you're going to have a mess. No themes or no clear themes integrated into the story. This one, again, goes back to the planning, and because they think that everything is done inspirationally, they're not thinking about what they want to write about specifically. They're just writing whatever comes to mind. So that's not conducive to you having a clear theme in mind by which to choose scenes to include. So even if there is a theme that happens to come out when they're writing, it is not going to be well integrated into the rest of the story. You're going to end up with scenes where the writer was obviously trying to kind of reach for it. If they have had some experience, you'll get some scenes that are very, I guess the best word to describe it is preachy. You'll get very preachy scenes where the writer is almost hitting you over the head with what they think. Or if they're trying to avoid that, you'll get nothing. And that's where you end up with books where there's no clear theme whatsoever. So it's not integrated into the story one way or the other if you do that. Next harmful effect of inspirational writing is burnout, or the alternative when you burn out is running to fans, friends, or other authors. So burnout here essentially means the person has run out of ideas that their subconscious can feed them, and because they never really learned or wanted to consciously think about what they were going to write and why, they have nowhere to turn when their subconscious runs out of material to feed them. So they just end up stuck. And many of these authors, if they burn out early on, they just don't keep writing. If they already have an established fan base or group, you will often see these writers running to their fans, friends, or other authors that may be in the group and asking them for ideas because they've run out of them. The most extreme end of this spectrum is the asking other people what you should write kind of a thing, or when you see an author, a fiction author particularly, this is usually where I see it, they will ask their fans to kind of like write the book with them or whatever. Okay, that's fine if you're doing D&D and everybody knows that that's what you're doing, and then you're going to take the role play and write it all down as you go along. It's interactive and collaborative storytelling. You're sort of doing something similar when you do multi-author books, but not necessarily. The key difference there is that with the roleplay style writing, you don't have a clear end goal in mind usually, unless your game master has an end goal and kind of forces the players into following the right path. But if you've got one that's relatively expansive, those kinds of works are more focused on the character building and the world building, not the plot or the theme, because the plot and the theme can be all over the place and they usually don't have a theme. And that's fine if that's the kind of writing that you want to read, but that is not a novel. It might be an interesting story if you enjoy that kind of a thing. I mean, it can be fun to see what other people have done with that kind of a thing. I have a sister who really enjoys watching D&D podcasts where people are playing doing interactive role playing together. And some of those are interesting. There's nothing wrong with that if that's what you're intentionally doing. But if you are an author and you're meant to be writing novels, not interactively telling stories with friends and fans, then running to friends and fans and saying, what do you want me to write? And let's write it together is not good. Because you're not going to you're not going to credit everyone for their ideas in the book. That would make no sense. It would be crazy for a novel to sit down and list out what each person wrote. And most of the authors who do this are not going to put the names of everyone who participated onto the cover as though they are the authors. So, yeah, that's a real problem, because then at that point you're plagiarizing other people's ideas, and that is unethical and unacceptable. So that extreme side of it is an obvious harm. There's the issue too of the legal implications of that, and copyright issues, and theft of other people's ideas. You hope that nothing bad would happen, but if you are interactively writing with fans with the understanding you're just going to put your name on it as though you've written the whole entire thing, and as though all of the ideas are yours, well, there have been cases where people have done that kind of a thing, and then later the fan or the friend decided that they wanted to write their own thing with that idea, and the author ended up in a bunch of trouble legally, because the fan or the author or friend was able to say, this was my idea originally and you stole it. So that's a legal harm of this extreme form of inspirational writing, but it all stems from the same idea that they're working off of a subconscious impulse, not off of a conscious intent. And so when they run out of those subconscious impulses, they're either going to burn out, or they're going to go to everyone else for their ideas, because they either can't afford or don't want to quit putting stuff out there on the internet or publishing. So then our next point is that if you're subconsciously stuck, potentially permanently stuck. So, okay, you're not necessarily permanently stuck, but with this one, what we're trying to say here is that when these writers hit writer's block, when they hit a point where they are subconsciously stuck and their subconscious mind is no longer able to throw out there the ideas, whether it is for the novel in general or whether it is for whatever they are writing, these writers get stuck and they have no way to untangle the problem. The only thing that they can do is walk away from it and not think about it and hope that their subconscious mind comes up with a solution. Or alternatively, they can go to other people to get ideas and basically tell somebody else, I have this problem, please help me figure out how to get myself out of the hole I've written myself into. I know plenty of people who do this. And again, this goes back to the other point of plagiarizing other people's ideas. You should not be asking other people to solve the problems you create when you're writing. Now, there's nothing wrong with going to someone and saying, I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I can't find a good solution. Here's what I'm struggling with. Do you have any general thoughts or advice? There's nothing wrong with that, but don't ask them to, give you the end of the scene or whatever. You should have figured that out in your outlining stage. The final problem that they'll run into is that some of these writers, not all of them, but many of them, they end up writing for everyone but themselves. This happens a lot when they ask fans, what do you want me to write? Authors who are writing for other people generally do tend to be the inspirational sorts, because an intentional writer is not going to do that. An intentional writer is going to ask, what do I want to write about? What theme interests me? And what specific integration of that theme into a story or an essay interests me? Generally speaking, they're not going to write for other people. So an example of this is, in my case, I've done some ghostwriting in genres that I don't write. I would never ever do ghostwriting for somebody in a genre that I publish. So fantasy and philosophical fiction. I would not write that for somebody else unless my name was going to go on the cover and the topic interested me, because I'm not writing for other people.
I'm writing for me, and the audience that enjoys what I have to say will come along, and I'm okay with that, and I'm honest about that, that I'm not writing for an audience or fans. I put it out there because I know that there are other people that are looking for the kind of fiction that I enjoy writing and that I enjoy reading. I know that there is a dearth of fiction of the sort that I write, and so I put it out there so that other people can benefit sort of secondhand from what I did for myself. I don't mind other people benefiting from it, but they're not the reason I do it. But for an inspirational writer, a lot of times, because they rely on everyone else to give them ideas when they run out of them, you are going to see a lot more of them writing for everyone but themselves. Or the other thing that can sometimes happen here is that it ends up being hypocritical. They start to write for themselves, but they're not, they don't want to admit that they're writing for themselves and not the fan group because they feel for whatever reason that would look bad. And so usually these writers will say stuff like, they'll try to play it off as an idea that the group had, or with Christian writers, sometimes I'll see them say, well, God gave me the idea. It kind of is playing two roles there. One is that, again, they're attributing their subconscious mind throwing ideas to them, to God. And then second, it's an excuse if anything isn't, written perfectly, or if it doesn't look good, well, God gave me the idea, so how dare you tell me that it isn't good? On the extreme side of the spectrum. Okay, so moving on from the harm, I promised I was going to talk about mystical or inspirational writing and beginners. The first thing that I want to start with is the seat of the pants writing. Now, this is something that you can see experienced writers doing, but in my experience with the different people that I've worked with, most of the time, the people who are writing seat of the pants, like truly 100% seat of the pants, are beginners. This is usually because they have a strong aversion to outlines. For whatever reason, outlines seem to be scary to you guys. I've always kind of been a planner and an outliner, so I don't fully understand why they're scary. Back when I first started writing, though, I didn't often work off of outlines, or at least I didn't work off of outlines that were specific enough to be of any actual use to me. I didn't even really, because I didn't have any formal education in fiction writing specifically at the time that I started, I didn't even know that outlines were a thing, to be honest. So for some beginners, it may just be that they don't know that is a method. But if you are listening to this and you are a beginner, we're going to talk about outlines here. So number one, don't be scared of them. They're not scary. They're actually going to be your best friend, because until you reach the point where you have enough experience that you're able to hold in your mind the theme and a general idea of what you need to include in order to reach the conclusion of that theme, you want to have it written out on paper. So let's start with what an outline is, because I think a lot of times people say outline and writers get this scary idea of like 600 pages worth of writing. If your outline is as long as the book that you're working on or the short story that you're doing it wrong. That's a summary. And even then, a summary should not be as long as the actual novel. If it is, that's a problem. And I can understand why you'd lose interest in writing it if you've basically just summarized the entire novel in one go. So don't do that. Don't shoot yourself in the foot. An outline is essentially literally just meant to give you the bare bones of what is necessary. You should be writing it in full sentences, because that's going to help you to have something a little bit more concrete to work with. It forces you to be more specific rather than just writing down the most general thing that you can think of. So make sure you are specific. Start with your theme. Figure out what it is that you want to actually write about. What is the central idea that your piece of writing is going to focus on? Once you have that, then you can start forming the outline. And what you want to put into the outline is full sentences. You can put it in bullet points, or you can put it, if you wanted to say chapter 1 and then put your sentence is for whatever, you need to include in that, you can do it that way. Whatever you feel most comfortable with. I'll show an example of one of my outlines, but don't copy the way that I do it. The way that I do it is fine once you've got some experience under your belt. If that works better for you, perfectly fine to do it that way. There's nothing wrong with it. It will work, but you shouldn't attempt it if you're a beginner, because it's not going to give you enough to work with. I did not start out using the form of outline that I'm going to use as an example. That was something that I only did after I'd had a little bit of experience. So yes, the outline example that you're seeing up on the screen now is not what you should attempt to do to start out with. So think about some of the outlines that you may have been required to do in school that were full sentence outlines to tell the teacher exactly where you were planning to go with the essay. Well, you want to do something similar to that with your fiction. It doesn't necessarily have to have all the levels or be as detailed as that, but it should give you a good roadmap of all the high-level points that you need to include in order to prove the theme, or in order to develop the theme, so that the reader, by the time that they get to the end, has no doubt in their minds whatsoever what your theme is. So that's the end goal. You want them, by the end, to know what the theme was, if they were paying attention. Obviously, you can't help it if the reader is not paying attention. That's not on you. But if they are paying attention, they should be able to figure out what the point was. So your outline should include the theme at the top. I would recommend you should write the theme down and be as explicit and concrete about what that theme is as you are able to be. That should be very specific and concrete, because you're going to then use that to determine further what sort of story best fits that theme, and then from there what sort of events you want to have happen. So once you've kind of got the theme down, and once you are decided on the type of story you want to tell with that theme, you should start in full sentences outlining the things that you need to do or you need to write about in order to get from the beginning to the end and have the reader understand what the theme is. That's all that there is to it. That is all there is to an outline. It can be as long or as short as you need it to be. It doesn't have to be a big production. The entire point is just to have something there to help you in order to integrate your theme properly with the rest of the novel. It's going to help you to be intentional from the get-go. If you don't do this, you're going to be writing by inspiration by default, because you have no idea where you're going. So you're just making it up as you go along, and that usually ends in a mess for most writers, and especially for beginners. Okay, so moving on from the outlines, now that we've established that there's nothing to be scared of and that, yes, in fact, you should do them, I want to talk about another problem that this sort of inspirational writing creates for beginners, and that it can create it for experienced authors too, and it often does. But for beginners, a lot of times the problem here, and the reason that they turn to inspirational writing to begin with, is because of a lack of immersion and material to inform the conscious and subconscious mind. In other words, they are not immersing themselves in the world around them in an intentional way to learn. They're not reading with the intent to learn, like we kind of discussed in brief earlier. They're not looking at everything that they're learning and trying to integrate it into their understanding of the world, and thereby the worldview approach they're going to take with their writing. Because your worldview will come out in your writing, and what you have to say about the world and humanity as a whole is going to show whether you intend for it to do so or not. So you want to make sure that you are immersing yourself in learning, that you're reading as much as possible, and that you're very intentional about the reading that you're doing and trying to identify the things that people have done well or not so well, what you liked and what you didn't, and why. Always, always, always be asking why. That is the best way for beginners to avoid falling into the trap of becoming an inspirational writer, because it allows them to hone their conscious mind to think about things in a logical and rational way. And it also informs their subconscious mind in the process of what they do and don't like, so that their subconscious mind kind of has it in the background already that this is what we're going for and this is what we aren't going for. So then when you do sit down to write and you're relying on your subconscious mind to find a way to take your conscious goal and make it happen in a way that is enjoyable to you and hopefully later to the reader, your subconscious mind then has something to work with. Most beginners don't have this, so they automatically move to the inspirational side of the spectrum because it's more comfortable. Just don't let that be you. Don't. It's going to take work, it's going to take time, but if you're outlining properly and you're combining it with an active attempt to immerse yourself and to continue to learn about things from all different, subjects, you are going to be a lot better off, and you're going to start to move from that inspirational side of the spectrum to an intentional writer. The final reason that I think a lot of beginners end up in this inspirational writer type of bucket, just sort of by default, is a combination of uncertainty and or insecurity. So usually with beginners, I do hear a lot of uncertainty and insecurity. So they're uncertain about their own level of writing skills. They have no real way of assessing that, and they tend to write by inspiration because it's comfortable. So that's kind of the uncertainty piece sorts them into it because they don't really know what they're doing or how to go about it. Nobody's really told them. Maybe they've read a few writing guides, but they're not really sure. So the combination of a lack of knowledge and uncertainty leads them to just kind of go for it. And there's nothing wrong with starting out that way as long as you don't stay that way. The second reason with insecurity, this I usually see with writers in general who are not willing to lay claim to both the strengths and the faults of their work. Inspirational writers in general tend to do this, but beginners tend to be a lot more insecure usually, because they kind of have in the back of their minds that writing is not a skill and it's just something you're either good at or not. And if they're good at it, then they're probably not insecure about it. If they are, if they get the sense that they're bad at it or other people have told them they are, then they're insecure. And so it's a lot easier if you're insecure about your own ideas to turn to saying, well, I just write whatever comes to me. Or, well, God told me to write this. It's a lot easier to say that than it is to say, this was my idea. I sat down and thought about it, and this is how I wanted to write it. Saying that second takes a lot of courage, because if it wasn't done so well, or you receive criticism, that's going to mean you can't hide behind, oh, well, it was just the first idea that came to me. Maybe it needs some more work. You can't really hide behind that. You are left in a position where you have to defend why you think the work is good, or else admit that the other person is right and go back to the drawing board. It really forces you to look at writing as a skill, not a self-esteem issue. And a lot of beginners, because they're insecure, do tend to tie their skill naturally at writing to their self-esteem. And so they don't want to necessarily take responsibility for the idea, especially if they have had issues in the past with people being unkind in their feedback. So if that's you, don't move that direction. It's not worth it. It's tough being a writer. You do get feedback that's not so fun. But have the courage to say, this was my idea. Okay, maybe it wasn't a good idea and I'm going to go back to the drawing board, but it was my idea and I took the time to think about it. And maybe I didn't think enough, and it's okay to admit that. Just don't give up on it. So put the work in, don't give up, and don't be insecure about it. Don't feel like because something you wrote wasn't good enough, you're not good enough. That can lead you into a lot of the different problems that we talked about with inspirational writing, and it's just not a good path to go down. Don't put yourself in that position. All right, so I've talked a lot about all the problems with inspirational writing, so some of you who are inspirational writers right now might be wondering, well, Ariel, am I just screwed? So, no. Here's the good news. You can move from inspiration to intent. So there are a couple of different ways that we do that. The number one way to do it is to start asking why. At first, this is going to seem unnatural and maybe a little bit stupid, especially because at first, the things you're asking why about may seem kind of obvious. You don't just start out asking profound questions in the realm of why. Like, you have to actually learn to observe and to be thoughtful about the things that you're seeing and observing in order to ask intentional why related questions. But you need to start asking them. So even if you don't ask anyone else at first and the only thing you're doing is asking why about some basic assumptions that you hold, that is a step in the right direction. Just keep at it. Keep asking why, and eventually you will need to move to asking other people why too, so that you can start to understand other people's methodologies and ways of thinking, and get confirmation maybe for the answer to the why. But the second thing that you should be doing is observing the world around you. And I don't just mean observing it like, oh, that sunset is really beautiful, I want to describe it in concrete terms. Well, okay, that's a good thing. You should be doing that too. Every writer should be doing that. And I don't think that inspirational writers avoid that or don't do that. When we're talking about observing the world around you, I more mean when you're asking why, try to find the why. Look for the connections between what you're seeing and thought patterns, emotions. Look for the reasons that things are happening, and then ask yourself how that fits into your writing and into your view of the world in general, and how can you express that in your writing. This is usually where the themes come from, right? This is where your observation of the world around you leads you to a philosophy that gives you different ideas and concepts to talk about. It won't necessarily give you the story that fits it best, but it will give you the initial germ of an idea that all of those scenes are going to revolve around. The third thing you need to be doing is intentional reading. Yes, this is bad news for any of you who think that you can write without being readers. You can't. You can't. You are never going to become better if you do not read. And that means reading a lot and reading work that is not yours. I'm sorry to say, but there's no shortcut really on this. Now, you can listen to audiobooks, for example, if that's easier. Like, you can still do it that way. I don't mean that you have to necessarily be physically reading every word. Whatever way allows you to best absorb the material is fine. I prefer print or Kindle books because I can go back and find things that I want to reference more easily for research stuff, but I don't necessarily need that if I'm working through a fiction book or something and all I'm looking for is to see what I do and don't like about the piece. But it does need to be intentional reading. You can't just turn your brain off and listen to it for enjoyment purposes. There's nothing wrong with listening for enjoyment purposes, but when you're doing intentional reading, you want to make sure that you're asking a couple of key questions. First, what do I like about this book? Second, and it should be concrete. These should be actual concrete things you can point to in the book that you like about the book. Not just, oh, well, I think they wrote something that sounded nice. Or, oh, high level things like their characterization was good. That doesn't mean anything, okay? Any piece of good fiction has good characterization, or a decent plot. That doesn't tell you anything. That's not useful to training your subconscious to look for the things that it should be doing when you're writing. So try to be conscious about, I liked that, maybe for example, I liked that the characters had this particular worldview. Or maybe even more specific than that, I liked this particular aspect of this character's worldview, and then state why you liked it, because that's really important. It's not enough to just know what you like. You also need to understand why you like it. So those are like the first two questions you should be asking is what did I like and why did I like it, and be specific. And then the other thing that you should be doing, the other two questions that you should be asking is what don't I like and why don't I like it? Encapsulated in both of those questions is also kind of the idea of what did they do well versus not well and why, what worked, what didn't, why. So those are all different things that you can look at in terms of intentional reading. Another approach that you can take to it is that if you're trying to learn a specific skill within writing, for example, if you're trying to learn how to world build, you might intentionally read by picking authors that are well known for being good at that aspect of writing, and then trying to identify the underlying techniques and principles behind what makes them so good at it by reading their work. That is also an excellent method to go about intentional reading. You should really be doing both. Next on the list is conscious planning and editing. So most inspirational writers in particular have no idea how to consciously plan or edit. When they do plan, it's kind of, again, they're basically doing a rudimentary form of what they do when they write by just kind of jotting down whatever comes to them with no real assessment of whether or not it works well, whether it fits with a theme, nothing like that. They're just putting down whatever makes sense to them at the time. And usually what happens there is that they start writing, they get off track with the plan, or they're following the plan, but it doesn't work out the way that they thought it would, and they write themselves into a mess. Most of them have no idea how to edit. They can proofread, but proofreading for grammatical errors is not the same as editing to make sure that every single, scene, paragraph, sentence, word is in there for an actual reason, and that it was intentionally chosen, and that it fits with the theme, and that everything is integrated. They're not editing to integrate, they're editing to try to prettify the words that they've put on the page. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. I'm not saying that that's not part of the editing process, but that's the last part of the editing process, not the first. And they usually skip over all the other steps in editing to go straight to that, because any of the other steps require them to consciously look at the writing by some sort of a standard to determine what should go, what should stay, what needs to be added, what needs to be removed. They're not equipped to do that. And they're usually not conscious enough of why they included things or didn't include them to even start doing that. So if you want to move from being an inspirational sort of writer to an intentional sort of writer, you have to start asking yourself, consciously planning out your work. So start outlining if you weren't already. Be specific and intentional in what you're putting in the outline. Center it on a central idea or theme. And then when you edit, you're able to go back to that central idea or theme and ask yourself, why should this stay? And that ought to be the question. Why should this stay? Why is this here? You don't need to have a ton of reasons why it needs to stay. There's really only one reason you need, and that is it's necessary to prove the theme. When it comes to fiction writing, this gets a little bit more hazy because obviously you are dealing with an emotional side, and so the point of it staying might be, my goal for this character was for them to get here at the end of the story, and in order for them to get here, this has to happen, so it should stay. That's fine. That is a perfectly good justification for keeping something. But when you're editing, that's the kind of mindset you need to have if you're going to be an intentional writer. And that requires conscious planning as well as conscious editing. And then next up, we have training the subconscious mind for the writing process. You're kind of doing this when you do intentionally read, because you're teaching your mind, your subconscious, what you like and what you don't, and why you like it and why you don't. So in a form, when you take the time to actually intentionally notice what you like, you're telling your subconscious, take note of this. This is something that I thought was really cool that someone else did, or I thought that this was particularly well done, so I want to pay attention and try to find ways to use that technique in my own writing, or maybe I like the imagery that this author used, so where possible, I want to try to write imagery that's similar if it fits with the moment that I'm working on. You're telling your subconscious that when you consciously and intentionally take note of those things in other people's work. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to read and to do so intentionally, because while you're consciously and intentionally reading and observing the techniques, you are giving your subconscious the material it needs to be better at its portion of the job of writing. So that's good news for those of you who like to read, because it means you kind of are hitting two birds with one stone right there. And then the last thing that I've got on the list here is to learn to deal with the stuck moments in an intentional way. So this refers mostly to writer's block, where it is an issue of you know what to write, you want to write, but it's just not working. Okay. When you are in that situation, the worst thing that you could do is walk away from it and not think about it, because your subconscious is not going to solve the problem. The only thing that it can do is tell you that there is a problem by refusing to actually put words on the page that work or that make any sense. The only thing that tells you when you see that happening is that there is a problem and a conflict between what you intended to do and what is actually happening. So the way you deal with that intentionally is to mull over the problem. Think about it. If you know what the problem is already, then the mulling over process is mulling over, how do I fix it? If, and this is usually the case, if you're not certain exactly why the problem has occurred, why you're stuck, then you have to start asking questions about the situation and start asking, well, what is it that's causing the problem? My personal favorite way to start with it, if I'm stuck and it's just not coming and I wanted to write the scene, when I put it in the outline, I was excited about it, but then I went to go put it on page and I'm like, how do I do this? This isn't working. The first thing that I ask usually is, why is this not working? The second follow-up question, if I can't exactly pinpoint why it's not working when I am sitting there thinking about it, is to ask, why am I not excited about this? What is it that has me so hung up on this that the words are just not coming and I am dealing with this mental block that's keeping me from putting anything on the page? The absolute worst thing you can do, like I said, is to walk away and not think about it. The other really bad thing that sometimes people will do here, and I'm guilty of doing this sometimes too, is just pushing through it and trying to write anyway. If the issue is not that you're just feeling tired and not in the mood, pushing through it is not going to help, because the problem is still there, you haven't resolved it, and now you're just writing junk. So don't do that. I recently had to do this with a school project that I had. It was a creative nonfiction essay detailing my faith journey. And I knew what I wanted to say. I knew the scenes that I wanted to include that related to my theme. But I had a deadline. I was sick. I was stuck. And I didn't have time to think about it. And frankly, I didn't have the mental, energy or capacity to think about it. I had a really bad and nasty head cold, and I just wasn't able to focus. So obviously, if you're just not able to focus because of being sick or something, if you're able to, you should be taking the time to rest. In my case, I pushed through it anyway. The editing was so painful on that, guys. Don't do that to yourselves. If I hadn't had a deadline, I would not have done that to myself. I would have waited. I would have figured out the problem on the points where I was stuck after I felt better and mentally capable of handling it. And I would not have had nearly as much editing to do. And the editing was just an absolute pain. I went through it almost a full 3 times before I was happy with what I had and felt like it was actually working at the sentence level. So dealing with the stuck moments intentionally means knowing when you need to stop writing and focus on the actual problem, whether that is focusing on figuring it out so you can fix it, or whether that is mulling over the solution. But find the solution, find the problem, Be intentional about doing that. It's going to require thinking. It's going to require some time, and there's no cut and dry way to fix it, and it's agonizing. I mean, if I'm going to be honest, it is agonizing. It's one of the worst things I think I've probably ever experienced about writing, because usually when you're in those moments, the way you know you are is that you do want to write, you know what you want to say, but it's just not coming. And you might rewrite something 5 times before you give up and realize, I truly am stuck and I need to just stop and figure out the problem so that I can come back to this and actually put something on the page that's useful. That's really frustrating, but there's no shortcuts really to dealing with that. You kind of just, you have to think through it, you have to be intentional about it, and not just avoid the issue hoping that it'll solve itself in the background, because generally speaking, it won't. Alright, so let's kind of wrap this up, guys, and summarize what we've talked about. So for those of you who are more experienced writers who are looking to move from inspirational to intentional writing, keep in mind what we just talked about. Your main focuses here really are altering the thought patterns, alter the way that you think about writing, consciously identify the aspects of your thinking patterns that are more of an inspirational sort of thought pattern about writing, and when you find yourself thinking things related to it and stemming from those kinds of beliefs and thought patterns, identify those and substitute the intentional side of things. So start changing how you think. Be willing to do the mental workout, because it's not easy. It is going to require you to sit down and think. Unfortunately, there's just, thinking is, consciously and intentionally thinking is the major difference between being an inspirational writer who lets your subconscious determine everything and being an intentional writer who engages the conscious mind to outline and edit and uses the subconscious mind for the actual writing process once they have determined where things are going. So they allow the conscious mind to inform the subconscious rather than the subconscious just doing whatever and hoping it all turns out well. It's a mental workout and there is no way around it. So if you are looking to move from one to the other, just accept that now. It is all about the connections and the concretes. It's all about the abstract principles and how they work out in an actual concrete, practical way. So as you're trying to move from one to the other, you've got to start looking for the connections. You've got to start looking at the abstract principles behind what you're doing and why you're doing it, and start looking for concrete examples that you can use to illustrate those in your own writing. So when it comes to writing, your theme is that connection piece to like the reader and the real world and you, and the novel or the story piece will be the collection of concrete examples that you're using to illustrate that connection or that abstract principle. Now, for some concluding advice for the beginners who may be watching this, start off right. You're at the very beginning. You have the time now, while everything is still relatively new to you, to start off on the right foot and not create problematic thinking patterns for yourself. Because you're new, you're able to take a look at how people have done things wrong and right and choose to build habits that are going to be helpful to you. You're able to start off with the right thought patterns and with the understanding that writing is a mental workout and you're not going to be able to avoid it. So if you want to be a writer, you have to be willing to think. So you can train yourself to do all of that. And because you're starting off already and it's all new anyway, and you're, just learning about all of it, you're able to include that right in there. And it's not like you're trying to get rid of, bad ways of thinking about things from the get-go. So you are in a better position than a writer who is more entrenched in the inspirational way of writing to start as an intentional writer right off of the bat. The second thing is avoid bad habits from the start. So don't form the bad habits. If it's not something that, if it's a thought pattern, if it's a way of approaching writing, or just an actual literal habit relating to how you write, you don't have to form those bad habits. You're starting off, you're just starting to form your habits. So be intentional about which ones you're forming and make sure that they're good ones that are going to support you as you're moving forward, not harm you in the future. And then the final piece of advice I have for you guys is feed your brain for future success and growth. Put into it now what you want to get out of it tomorrow. Don't think that if you don't do the work now, it's magically going to somehow get better down the road if you just keep writing. It's not the way it works. Yes, you need to practice. Yes, you need to be writing, and you need to be writing a lot, but you also need to be taking in good writing and bad writing alike from the get-go. And you need to be consciously trying to identify what's good and bad, and to be learning more about the craft itself. It's just like any other skill set. You don't learn to write a musical instrument usually by somebody just, sitting down and handing you the instrument and being like, okay, do whatever comes naturally. It's not going to come naturally. You're not going to be good at it at first, and that's okay. You succeed and you grow by learning more about the instrument, learning more about how to play, learning more about music theory, and all the things that relate to your area that you're working on, and then integrating that into what you're actually doing. So what you're doing is starting off right and avoiding bad habits from the start, but what you need to be making sure you're doing alongside that is actually putting input in so that you have the ability to produce something that is better in the future. So that's the tip, the major tips that I would have for you guys. I hope in some way this has proved helpful. I hope not too many people are mad at me for what I've had to say here. I'm sure that I've ruffled some feathers. But again, as I said at the beginning, I am not here to pick on anyone in particular. We're talking about the philosophy and the approach to writing, not a specific writer or author, which is why I didn't give any specific names or examples of people I've dealt with. What I've presented here is more just kind of the culmination of observations that I've made over the years. And as I've been thinking lately, in the last couple of years, about what the difference is and why I've seen these behavioral patterns, this is kind of the conclusion that I've come to, and the observations that I've made about the reasons and the thought processes and philosophies behind it. So I hope that this has proved useful. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, or go ahead and just message me privately on Facebook if you want to do that. Introduce yourself, say hi, so that I know you have an actual reason to contact me and I don't think it's spam. But do feel free to reach out if you do have questions or comments to make. And until next time, guys.